The tiny mountainous country of Switzerland has been in a state of perpetual neutrality since the major European powers of the time declared it as such during the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Why did they do this? The French conquered Switzerland in 1798, established the Helvetic Republic in an attempt to make Switzerland something of a strategically positioned French satellite state. Not long after, Austrian and Russian forces invaded the country in their war against France. The Swiss, rather than fighting alongside their French overlords, largely refused. This ultimately led to the Act of Mediation, giving the Swiss back much of their former independence. 12 years later, they got the rest thanks to the aforementioned Congress of Vienna, in which their neutrality in the wars of their neighbors was officially recognized. Beyond the Swiss themselves having long tried to stay out of the conflicts of Europe since the early 16th century after a devastating loss at the Battle of Marignano, part of the reason Switzerland was granted neutrality in perpetuity in 1815 is because the European powers of the time deemed that the country was ideally located to function as a valuable buffer zone between France and Austria. Thus, granting their neutrality in wars, so long as they continued to stay out of them, would contribute to the stability in the region. Since that time, with a few minor exceptions, Switzerland has steadfastly refused to compromise its neutrality for any reason. That said, Switzerland did need to defend its borders from both Allied and Axis air incursions during World War II. For instance, they shot down nearly a dozen German planes in the spring of 1940 alone, as well as shot down some American bombers and forced down countless others on both sides. On this note, officially Switzerland maintains a policy of aggressive neutrality, and thus has long put itself in a terrifyingly overprepared position to fight, and made sure every country around them was, and still is, well aware of this fact. As for specifics, the Swiss military is a highly trained and competent fighting force, and due to the country's policy of compulsory conscription of males, it is surprisingly large for a country of only around 8 million people. For example, during times of potential conflict, their active duty military force has occasionally reached near half that of the present-day US military, a country about 40 times Switzerland's populace. Further, Switzerland is massively overprepared for any conflict thanks to the Swiss National Redoubt. In a nutshell, Switzerland has taken advantage of its unique natural geography, which includes mountains that surround it on nearly all sides, to build countless bunkers, fortifications, and warehouses across the country that can be accessed at a moment's notice. Initially, the National Redoubt consisted of tunnels bored into the many mountains of Switzerland in key strategic positions for retreating troops and citizens to take shelter in. But over the years, these have evolved to encompass a host of ingenious defensive and offensive structures. Along with the tunnels and bunkers, which are fully stocked and contain everything from bakeries and hospitals to dormitories, and even hidden hydroelectric plants for maintaining electricity, the mountains of Switzerland also hide countless tanks, aircraft, and hidden artillery guns, some of which are pointed directly at Switzerland's own roads to destroy them in the event of invasion. As for more specifically how they kept themselves out of the world wars, during World War I this wasn't difficult, and after it became apparent that Switzerland's neutrality would be recognized by all powers in the First Great War, the vast majority of the Swiss troops were sent home and nothing further was required to keep the Swiss out of World War I. World War II, though, was a different beast altogether, with Switzerland not banking on Hitler respecting their long-held neutral stance in European conflicts. Thus, they began to rebuild their military, bringing the number up to 430,000 combat troops within 3 days of the start of the war, and strongly encouraged its citizens to keep, at minimum, 2 months' worth of supplies on hand at any given time. On top of that, they also began secret negotiations with France to join forces against Germany should Germany attack Switzerland, as well as drastically ramped up their World War I era strategy of making invading Switzerland as unsavory an option as possible. They even had plans to use the Alps as a base from which to both launch guerrilla attacks to make life miserable for any successful invasion force, and to use highly defensible positions there to keep crucial supply lines from the invaders. More controversially, Switzerland continued to trade with Nazi Germany during the war in order to further de-incentivize Hitler from invading. The multi-pronged plan worked, and while Hitler did have a detailed plan in place to invade Switzerland eventually, the cost of doing so was always deemed too high. From here, Switzerland stepped up their level of defense during the Cold War. Towards this end, Switzerland's roads, bridges, and train lines were all rigged with explosives that could be detonated at any time. In many cases, the engineers who designed the bridges were required to come up with the most efficient way, using explosives, to ensure the complete destruction of those same bridges. Once the destruction plan was developed, hidden explosives were installed at the appropriate locations in the bridges. On top of that, the military also lined hundreds of mountains flanking major roads with explosives to create artificial rock slides. All total, over 3,000 points of demolition are publicly known to have been implemented throughout the small country. With ground attacks covered, the Swiss looked to the skies. Unfortunately for them, attack by air is much harder to defend against for a country so small that enemy air forces could penetrate anywhere within its borders before an adequate defense could be mustered. So, to protect against this, the Swiss government constructed thousands of bomb shelters in homes, towns, and cities to such a degree that it's estimated that almost all of the country's population could hide in them for extended periods. Many of these shelters also included small hospitals and the necessary equipment to set up independent command centers. In fact, homes built after World War II were often made with over 40 centimeters, 16-inch, thick concrete ceilings to help them survive aerial bombings. If your home didn't accommodate such a shelter, you had to pay a tax to support places that did. Speaking of World War II, if you liked this video, you might also enjoy this video on the soldier who fought in World War II with a sword, a bow, and also enjoyed leading his men into battle blaring away on his set of bagpipes.